Business Morning right here on Channels Television. Let's talk electricity supply now. Distribution, generation, supply. And of course, we're looking at it from the private sector. We know that the new law has been passed where states are empowered to generate and supply and distribute. And expectedly, they should be working with the private sector. Let's have a representative of one of that private sector right here, the Managing Director of Wilbeck Electricity, Mr. Afolabi Aiyela, is right here in the studio. Mr. Aiyela, good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me again.
Yeah, so the claps, applause, cutting of ribbon, as they say, is over. The new bill or the law is supposed to have been activated, especially in a state like Lagos.
Yes.
But has it started working?
Yes, so I think we're all aware that the governor has signed into law the Lagos State Electricity Bill, and it seems as though the state governments have got to work immediately. They've hit the ground running. Two major initiatives of the law. Firstly, that there are open transmission and distribution lines. This means that private investors now have access to the existing distribution and transmission infrastructure. Of course, they will only use this in partnership with the owners of this equipment, this infrastructure, the DISCOs and the transmission company. But there's a way that we can all work together that will foster private sector investment.
So this is still talking about the grid or the power generated from the national grid. This is not talking about an extra generation from the private sectors or from the states.
Yes, there'll be private sector generation, because as companies like us, if we have access to the existing network, we can then build power plants that are independent, but then feed into the existing network. That's what the law allows. And then the state is also trying to encourage investors by providing some sort of guarantees and incentives to investors. There may be certain breaks and waivers and so on and so forth to encourage private investors to build power plants in Lagos. It may interest you to know that we produce about 40,000 megawatts of electricity ourselves in Nigeria. The national grid accounts for about 4,000 megawatts. Private generators produce about 40,000 megawatts of power. In Lagos, it's about 15,000 megawatts. So the idea is if we can get investors to come in and take care and replace that demand, the demand that's currently being met by your diesel generator, by your petrol generator that you're using for your shop, for your business, for your home. The idea is that if we can get investors to come in and invest, they will take up that 40,000 demand that's currently being met by private citizens.
Yeah, because I've heard this calculation before. So individually, we're generating about 40,000, but
Correct.
Still we do not have enough because it's haphazard. It's not coordinated. Now, you are one of those investors that the government hopes to attract. Are there incentives enough for you to get into this space? Because the DISCOs still complain that the tariff is too low for them to operate on.
I mean, there are incentives, but then there are also hindrances. I have to commend the government, the Lagos state government, the federal government. They've done a lot, but there's still a lot more to do. I can mention one of the incentives or one of the programs is the Integrated Resource Plan that was just announced yesterday by the Minister of Power. It's a partnership with Nigeria and the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. They have a plan which is slightly different to the Siemens plan to come in and help companies like us develop power plants and then also reach out to the unelectrified areas as well. So there are some, the government is working, the government is doing some things, but more needs to be done. You mentioned tariff and pricing. One of the major issues that we independent power producers face is that we, along with Nigerian manufacturers, are paying about $9.12 per million scuff or, for gas, for natural gas, piped gas. The Gencos pay about $2.42 per million scuff. The international price of gas at the moment is about $3.66 per million scuff. So you can imagine Gencos are paying around $2.50. International price is just over $3.50. We independent producers and manufacturers that use gas for their boilers, for other equipment, are paying almost 3 times that, $9.12. Again,
do we know why this disparity of pricing? I mean, even compared from the global, and then you now compare, because we've had manufacturers talk about this a whole lot.
Yeah. I couldn't, I can't speak definitively because I'm not the government, but from what I understand, there was a concession. There was infrastructure, private company built infrastructure, gas pipelines, and so on and so forth, so they had to recover that funding. But I think it's been over 20 years. It's been over 20 years now. So I think it's time for the government to revisit this. If we can get gas at a lower price, at the same price, or even somewhat higher than the Gencos, but significantly lower than what we're paying now, we will be able to supply power to manufacturers at a much lower cost. If we are able to take up some of the power demand, it takes off some of the demand from the discos, from the national grid. They will then have more power to supply to their customers. It's a win-win. So I think something that definitely has to be addressed is domestic gas for domestic use. The price we're paying for domestic gas to produce power for industries, and then also that the gas price is still fixed to a dollar price. Gas should be in Naira, just like Dangote sells his diesel, his fuel in Naira. Gas that is produced in Nigeria should be sold in Naira. And then, of course, there shouldn't be any VAT on gas. VAT on gas should be completely removed. There's still some argument as to whether piped gas should be VAT waived, because CNG, there's no VAT. All other energy products, you don't pay VAT on. You only pay VAT on piped gas. That's the only energy product you pay VAT on. So if we're talking about industrializing, revitalizing industry in the nation, getting manufacturers up and running, producing more so that we export more, import less, and our Naira becomes stronger. The only way we're going to be able to do that is if manufacturers have access to power. Government can use independent power producers like us. If they can work with us, we can work with the manufacturers. We can see industry revitalized, and then see GDP increase, a stronger Naira, and of course, increase in jobs.
But I know that, independent power, and Governor Sanwo-Olu is someone I believe that's very interactive.
Yes.
Have you brought these issues, with him? What has been his reaction?
Yes, so we've had conversations with the Commissioner for Energy, who obviously represents the governor. He understands our position, and they're working on it. The first thing that they wanted to do was break the monopoly of the distribution and generation companies. So if you break the monopoly, you can have more entrants, more investors come in. So that has addressed one side or one issue in the sector. The other issue that we have, where there's a bit of monopoly in gas supply, especially to Lagos, we're working on that and working on coming up with a solution. But I can't give you too much information yet, so I'll come back to let you know more.
Okay, so the world is talking about renewables.
Yes.
Is gas our renewable? We know we have abundance of gas reserve, which is yet untapped. But we also have sun, solar,
yes,
and all of that, wind.
So I think if you drive around Lagos, you drive around Abuja, Port Harcourt, the major cities, you'll see a lot of businesses and private residences that have solar panels on their roofs. So it's a technology that Nigerians have adopted and have taken to. The only issue is that when it comes to large-scale power projects, one has to think of funding and availability of funds or availability of funding. To build 1 megawatt of solar, you're spending about 2 to 3 times what you're spending on building 1 megawatt of gas. The same plants that will produce the same amount of electricity. And then, of course, with solar, there's a much larger footprint. So also solar has a longer
maintenance.
Return on
Which
investment.
one is cheaper?
Of course, the solar in the long run is cheaper in terms of maintenance, in terms of consumables, etc. But the capital cost is the issue. Having that high capital cost, but then you have the benefits in the long run. And I'm talking about for large-scale projects, people like us who are building power plants to sell to end users, compared to a private house that I want to buy some solar panels, put on my roof to reduce my my energy consumption. So I think once we have access to longer tenured funding, cheaper funding, you can't borrow at 30–35% to build a solar plant and pay back in 2–3 years. So commercial banks really can't fund large-scale solar projects. But I'm quite excited that there's the African Energy Bank, I think, has just been established. So we understand that they'll be
the one
very
led by
interested.
AFDB.
Yes.
But the one by the US is being withdrawn now, the Africa Power Project, Power Africa Project, the one by the United States.
So let's hope that the Africa Energy Bank and AFDB can step in to take its place.
All right, but meanwhile, I wonder when we can really start feeling the impact of this bill that brings in more participants into the energy space and gives states the power to control. You know, it would really be nice if states can provide or generate their own power, and then we would see demand and supply, or demand for, you know, just like what's happening with petrol.
I think the best thing the state can do is not so much invest in power plants or in distribution, etc. What they can do is provide the enabling environment, which is what Lagos is doing. I believe Ondo State has just passed their own law and is looking to go the same way, which is for the state to essentially guarantee the investments of investors. So if I'm going to build a power plant, I might build my power plant. I'm worried that, and also the bank that's funding me is asking me and wants to know, these customers that you're selling to, how are you sure they'll pay you back? Are you sure some won't steal the electricity? Will you have issues with collection, etc., etc.? So what the state can then do is step in and say, okay, look, we can provide some sort of guarantees that if your electricity is stolen, or if you sell to people and they don't pay or anything like that, that we will provide some sort of guarantee. The details of this haven't been worked out fully, but I can tell you it goes a long way when we're talking to our bankers and we're saying, and they're asking those questions, and we're telling them that, okay, to mitigate against some of those risks, the state is willing to step in. So I think that's a perfect example of how the state can work with private investors without actually using their money to build power plants. Private investors can build the power sector. We just need government's help, that's all.
The guarantee, and we hope consumers would also stop the power theft and pay for what you consume.
I think we're seeing in areas that have high levels of power availability, collections are much better. Because once people have some trust in the system, that I have a meter, it's prepaid, I know that once I load it, it gets to this level. You know, when there's that trust in the system, people aren't going to game the system, they're not going to cheat it. You'll always have a small percentage anywhere in the world that will try and do those kind of things. But what we're seeing on ground really is that once people have access to power and they trust that you're being fair to them, you don't see theft, people pay their bills.
So that goes back to metering.
Yeah.
All right, it seems like a very big circle. It just goes round like that. But thank you so much, Managing Director of Welbeck Electricity, Mr. Afolabi Aiyela, for your time. I wish you the best. Really look forward to a change in the scene.
Yes. Thank you very much.
All right.